Welcome to Gold's Garage. So, first of all, thank you to all the new subscribers to my channel. That's very encouraging. And before I forget, if you're not a new subscriber, please do that. Like and subscribe. That's what makes making videos make sense. We're still working on our first 1,000. And if you watched my videos before, you probably know this story. I started making them a while ago just to sell my engines and demonstrate and sell my engines, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own that I never intended. However, I'm having fun with it, and I want to thank my producer, Mike Kimball, who's inspired me and helps me to do that, and my son up in the Sioux, who made the very first videos with me. Unfortunately, he's 8 hours away, and so he still makes all my thumbnails and helps me make videos when he's here. So very encouraging. So we're going to keep digging. And today I think I'm going to make probably the most valuable, if I was the video watcher, most valuable video that I made so far. And the subject is project management for car guys and girls. And I got some ladies responding to my channel as well, so that's pretty encouraging as well. So let me start off with a statement. Most projects take longer and cost more than they should. Some never get finished. Some guys or girls start and get halfway through and run out of money or get disillusioned or realize they're over their head and sell it off as a project, and some lucky person buys it for cents on the dollar and finishes it off and makes money on them. So don't be that person. So if you do the planning properly, this isn't going to happen to you, and today I'm going to help you through that. Just a little background. In my corporate career, project management was one of the things that I did, and most of my projects were in the millions and some of them in the hundreds of millions. The manual for that was about that thick, and I'm going to condense that down into 10 or 12 bullet points for you today, and I can give you the benefit of that in just a few minutes if you stick with me. So, biggest, most important factor that I have to mention is plan, plan, plan. Planning is a lot harder than, planning is thinking, and that's a lot harder than working. Most people would rather just jump in and start working, but that's a mistake. And the nice thing about planning, it's free. And if you make a mistake in the planning phase or you change your mind, it's a stroke of a pen or a click of a mouse and you fix the problem. After you buy parts and put them in your engine and you realize you didn't think it through or you get the right combination of parts, it's very expensive to fix. So every moment that you spend, every hour that you spend planning at the beginning of the project will pay back in big dividends. So how do you plan? That's what I'm going to show you today, is how do you do that. So one of the most important things is you start off by, you have to think the project through and write a job procedure. And that means sitting down and writing line item by line item of every step you're going to take to finish that project. And let's say you're going to take the engine out of your car and rebuild it. The first step is parking the car in a good spot and taking the hood off. And the last step is putting the hood back on. That's how detailed you need to be. And if you can't write step by step of all the things you're going to do to finish that project, you're probably not ready to do it. And you better figure that out before you start, because you're going to run into an issue that you never thought of, and it might be a deal breaker, and your project never gets finished. When you make those step-by-step line items of things you're going to do, take into consideration, make separate columns for the parts you're going to need, the tools you're going to need, the services you're going to need, and any other resources. Maybe you got to rent a shop or something in order to do that. And when you're looking at parts, you want to look at the total cost of the part, not just the catalog price, if there's shipping and tax on that part. Tools, have you got the tool? Well, you might not have it. You might have to rent it or borrow it or something. But you need to know how you're going to do that before you start, not when you get halfway through the project. So think that through before you start. And that's, for a lot of people, myself included, sometimes painful to sit and do that. But if you do it, it'll save you a lot of anxiety and stress later and a lot of costs, which is the most important part. So the next thing is you need to make a budget, because unless you're financially independent, money is important, and the cost of projects is important. It sure is to me. And so a budget is really important. And a budget is a matter of when you get to those columns of the parts and tools and services, you need to put a dollar figure on every one of those things. You need to add them up and total them up and find out what that is. Now, if you're lucky enough to have automated computer project systems like Excel or Project Manager or something, of course, that's going to make that easier to do. But at the same time, if you just have a pencil and a piece of paper, that works too. And a calculator would be nice. So you need to figure out how much it's going to cost. And so how do you do that? You look up the price of every part. You have to do in your planning. Let's say you're building an engine. You need to know what camshaft you're going to use, what heads you're going to need to use, what all the other parts. And make sure those parts all fit together. Some of my other videos are about balancing your compression ratio and your dynamic compression with your camshaft and your cylinder heads, etc. Do that thinking first and make sure you know those are the parts that you're going to use. And you total that up and get a number, and then you first of all, before you start, you decide if you know how to finance that project. So, and you shouldn't start it until you do. So when you do that, even though you made a budget, you need what's called a contingency. So a contingency is a line item that goes at the bottom of your budget that tells you, takes into consideration all the things that can go wrong, things you haven't thought of. Sometimes parts will cost more than you thought. Sometimes you get a part, you have to send it back, or breaks, or whatever else. And so it doesn't matter how knowledgeable and detailed you are, you need a contingency. And I use them all the time. And so here's how much contingency you need. If you have looked up the detailed price of every part, taken into consideration the shipping, the taxes, all the services you're going to need, how you're going to acquire tools, etc., then you maybe only need 20% contingency. If you just looked at a catalog and said, oh, camshaft's this much and the heads are this much, da-da-da-da, I think I know what I got here. You need 100% contingency, and trust me, you will need every cent of it because that's the way it's going to work out. You need to think that through. It's a lot better to face reality at the budgeting stage than halfway through when you realize it's going to cost more than you can afford and you never even finish the project. So that's really important. The next is research. So I'll start off with a term. My good friend Frank Van de Peer taught me this saying, experience is expensive. And by doing research, you can learn from other people's experience. When I started doing this, the only ways to learn, I bought Hot Rod Magazine every month. I read it cover to cover. Carcraft Magazine, read it cover to cover. I read manuals. And I was lucky enough to work at a Texaco garage and work for two mechanics who trusted me and took me under their wing and took time to teach me. And so I had a mentor. And if you got a mentor, someone you can learn from, do whatever you can to hang on to them and take advantage of it because that's certainly a very valuable asset to have. And once again, I've been lucky to have a few of them in my lifetime. So also research, the beauty nowadays is you got the internet, you got YouTube. So watch lots of YouTube videos, especially mine, of course. And you can just about type any problem or subject you want on YouTube or video or the internet and get an answer to your problem. So when you're doing that, when you're doing your research, think for yourself too, because there's lots of really good information out there and you can learn from that, but you can also, there's lots of information that's not quite valid as well. So think for yourself as well as when you do your research. One of the other ways is good old manual, and this was one of my resources. This is a 1968, a copy of a 1968 manual. I had the original years ago, but this is a copy of a 1968 manual. Tons of good information. These guys were pretty smart guys, so give credit to them. They designed these engines 50, 60 years ago. So we think we're pretty smart because we know how to make them a little better. Imagine figuring it out, designing the Hemi or the small block Chev or the small block Ford 50, 60 years ago. Also, any subject that you decide to do, every engine that you build, here's an example for Pontiacs. Here's a book about Pontiac engines. And I have in my shop one for 409s, one for straight six, Blue Flame 6s, one for small block Chevs, big block Chevs. etc. I even have one for LSs. And it doesn't matter how much you know or you think you know, you will learn by using manuals. So that's another way to do research, but do your thinking first before you do your spending. That's my message. Experience is expensive, so you can save a lot of money by doing your thinking first. Okay, so the next thing is when you get going, measure, record, and document. If you watch my channel before, you know that I do a lot of measuring, detailed measuring, and today we're lucky we have lots of tools which are not that expensive. Micrometers, dial indicators, dial bore gauges, etc., which make being able to do that a lot less costly. And I'm looking up here for, when you do your measuring, don't just put it in your head. Here's an example of an engine that I built, one of the pages of an engine I built, and for every engine there's a document like that showing every bearing clearance, every crankshaft journal diameter, every piston cylinder wall diameter, every piston diameter, valve spring pressures with the valve open, closed, etc., etc. All the details that you need to know. And when you have to document it, you have to think it through. So that's an advantage as well. So do that for every engine. Measure, record, and document, and keep that document someplace. Once again, if you're able to access a computer and you have Excel or Project Manager or one of those tools, it makes it a lot easier to do. But you know, when I started doing this, we didn't have any of that. We had a pencil and paper, and not even a calculator, for what it's worth. So that's an important part. So now we're going to get down to doing some work. So the next thing is organize your workspace. So before you start any project, first of all, before you start, let's say, assembling an engine like this one, all the parts and components have to be cleaned and prepared before you even start, and laid out in a place where you can easily find them. And then on your bench, if you're assembling, let's say we're going to put a crankshaft or a piston in this engine, there should be nothing on your bench but the parts and the tools that you need to do that specific step. And when that step's over, you put all those tools away and you look at the next step and you take out the parts and tools. Think of yourself as a surgeon in an operating room, because the analogy's pretty reasonable. There's 100 ways, 1,000 ways to make mistakes putting an engine together, and staying organized through the whole process, keeping your workspace clean and organized will help. And the best you can do is try. I'm not perfect. Sometimes I get to a point I can't find something on my bench. So the next step I do, I start putting everything away until I find the part or tool that I'm looking for, and it's always there someplace. So spend time doing that, and it'll help you avoid making mistakes, and it'll save you a lot of time in the long run. So where are we now? Organize your workspace. Remove distractions. So if you're doing something important, sometimes when I'm working away, I'm listening to the Eagles or Beach Boys or something on the radio or whatever, and that's fine. But if I'm doing something important, like say doing crankshaft journals or clearances on the crankshaft, etc., I turn off all the distractions and focus on what I'm doing until it's done and it's recorded. If someone stops by to visit, I put down the tools and I don't do any work until they're gone, because that's a great way to make a mistake. And I'm going to give an example that applied to me here in a minute. So remove all distractions from your background, and don't make decisions or make a critical move like that unless you have a perfect situation, or you will make mistakes. Read all instructions and read them before you start. There's a saying in this business, when all else fails, read the instructions. Well, that's not really, it's funny, but it's not really a good way to go. Read them first, and every time you open a part, there's usually some kind of an instruction in that box, in that container someplace. Keep digging until you find it. Don't try to put it together or get it half together and realize you don't know what you're doing, and maybe you threw out the box and the instructions are gone with it. Now you don't know what the heck you're doing. Get the instructions out and read them. I still do that, because even though I probably read those same instructions many times, they still change. They change from time to time. They actually do change from time to time. One is breaking in camshafts, for example. Cam manufacturers are adding extra stuff all the time about how to avoid camshaft and lifter failures. So that's just one example. Read the instructions and then keep those instructions and put them in a book of documents that you'll always have so that you have a reference to them at a later time. Check, check, and recheck. So I'm probably a little bit too much about that. For example, before I'm done with this engine, I'll probably recheck the main bearing torques and the rod bearing torques 2 or 3 times. And one of the things I do sometimes is I keep a little book like this, and just to make sure I don't go too crazy, I'll write down, I check the main bearing torques, I'll write it down at whatever, 3 o'clock on April the 2nd, I check the main bearing torques. That way I know that it's done. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I think it was the engine on that 302, I put it together and put the oil pan on it, went to sleep, woke up in the morning, I couldn't remember torquing the rod bolts. And I ended up taking the oil pan back off and checking it, which is really dumb, right? Sure enough, they were torqued, but if you document that it's done, you don't have that problem. Now, if you can rely on your memory, that's great, but the more you document things, the less you have to do that. So check, check, and recheck. Follow procedures. There's procedures for many things that you do, and if you follow them methodically, in industry now, any manufacturing process, there's a thing called ISO 1000. There's various versions of that, which dictates specific procedures for important things that have to get done to make sure there's no errors. And I'll give you a personal example. Just yesterday or day before, by the way, I've made a couple of short videos putting the crankshaft in, putting pistons in, and another one checking crankshaft thrust clearance. But anyway, I had 6 pistons in. I had the 7th piston in my hand, and I got a phone call. And if you watch the video we made on gapping piston rings, we know we leave the piston rings in the cylinder that they're gapped for. So when we go to put the piston in, we know exactly where they are in the order they come out. That's fine. But the oil rings, we don't. So I had the oil rings on the bench. I took a phone call, put the phone down, and came back to the job. I had the piston in my hand. I looked at the bench, and there's 3 oil rings. And there's only 1 piston left to put the rings on. And it only needs 2, which means I left a ring off one of those pistons somehow. Fortunately, it was the piston I had in my hand because I forgot when I took the phone call. Had I put that piston in and not checked until after, I would have to end up taking every piston out one at a time to find out which piston didn't have a ring on it. So that's a bitter experience, and you don't want to have that happen to you. So the right way to do that, and what I usually do, I didn't the other day, is set the rings down. There's 2 oil rings and the expander ring, of course. And after each piston, I look, and if after 1 piston's gone, there should be 2 oil rings gone, etc. And if you follow that procedure, you won't make that mistake. So it happened to me, and I was lucky that it was the piston that I had in my hand. Otherwise, I would have had a lot of work to do. And every time you have to take things back apart, you're just adding to the risk of it. So that's another point I wanted to make. Follow procedures. Correct mistakes. If you get into something and you don't really know if you're doing it the right way, or you think you put it together wrong, etc., don't put the oil pan on and wake up in the morning and wonder if you did it right. Stop and fix the problem now. Even if it takes your project takes longer. If you take our experience, when you get on the dyno and you make that first pull, you want to be sure that you followed all your procedures, because it could be catastrophic. You could have parts leaving the engine when it revs up. So you don't want to have that happen to you. If you think it through and follow procedures, correct your mistakes along the way, you'll probably do better. So the last one is keep all your documents for later. So every engine that I build goes in, all of the documents that I mentioned, the literature, instructions, advertising, whatever, for all the parts that I buy, the bills and receipts, etc., goes into a book of documents like this, and it's there forever. I have one of those for every engine I've ever built, and at least in the last 5 or 6 years anyways that I've ever built. And and is kept for reference. And from time to time, the dyno sheets go in there as well. So I have a question about something that happened on the dyno, whatever, I have a quick reference. And most of that information that I'm talking about, the information that I generate on Excel, is also in my computer as well for reference. So that's another thing you can do to keep sort of sleep at night better if you have all that done for you. So, okay, here's an example of project management, and there actually is a video I made a few years ago on my channel of this car. I think it's the front page video, sort of. And so I bought this car in 1969 and drag raced it, and I've referred to it already. I've rebuilt. I called it blueprinting the 302 in 1969, and probably wouldn't qualify technically to be blueprinting today, according to what we know. But anyway, I did sell it, and I was able to buy it back in 2015, and it had not turned a wheel since 1999, and it needed a restoration. Fortunately, it was stored in very good condition, so there was no rust on it. The floors are all original, all that stuff's all really good, but it needed to be restored. So brought it home in a trailer. It was up in Sault Ste. Marie. I went up and got it, brought it home in a trailer, and took it apart. I actually had an L78 396 in it at the time, which I actually put in for the owner back in the 1970s, and it was still there, and it still had the 488 rear end in it. So I bought it back and brought it back down here and in London, and I took it totally apart and did a complete restoration. And all of the things I just talked about in project management were applied to this project. I finished it. Actually, my part, it was finished in about 5 or 6 months, and the body shop took another 6 months to do the. It was the paint. It was painted, of course, with all totally apart and then put back together after. But it's been totally restored, and as I mentioned in other videos, it isn't the original engine. It's an engine out of my race car. It makes 453 horsepower. I dynoed this engine, so I know that. And so that's the engine that I use. It's fun to drive. A 302 is cool because it's original, but this is a lot more fun to drive, I can assure you, than the 302 is. But someday I may build one. And so it's been totally restored. I took the frame off it. The frame was powder coated. All of the suspension parts were powder coated. Every part in the car was totally rebuilt or reconditioned and repainted, and I got it back on the road in 2016, and I've been enjoying it ever since. So it's my pride and joy, and it was a pleasure doing this restoration. I'm not sure if I'd like to do another one, but this was special because it's my own keepsake, so it was important to me to do it myself, and I did enjoy it. Interior is all, it's basically as it was 50 some years ago, except the console's not there. It had a console at one time, and when you're drag racing, that's just in your way, so I threw that away a long time ago. Otherwise, it's exactly the same, but I've had this new upholstery, of course, and new carpet on the floor and all that kind of stuff, totally restored. And that's this. I have the original documentation for this car. And one of the best documents I have is a picture of me driving it on the drag strip in 1969. So you can't argue with that one. So thanks for watching. Long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. And project management, I'm sure I'm going to get questions and comments about that, and I welcome them. Some of your questions, you guys are keeping me on your toes for sure. I'm learning from my people that watch my channel. They come up with good questions and good comments and good advice, and I appreciate that. Thanks for watching Gold's Garage.